She was 20 years old, and she was going to die in the snow. That is where her story begins. Not with comfort, not with kindness, but with cold so complete it felt like a hand closing around her chest. Her name was Clara Whitfield, and 3 days before she stumbled through a blizzard in the high country above Hollow Pine, Montana territory. Her own uncle, Silas Whitfield, had put her out of the only house she had ever called home, told her the roof over her head was his now, that her father's debts belonged to her too, and that a grown woman with no husband and no trade was nothing but another mouth he could no longer feed. She left with $7 sewn into the hem of her coat, a tin cup, her mother's sewing needles wrapped in a handkerchief, and nothing else in the world. When she saw the weathered, half-collapsed trapper's lodge leaning against the tree line like an old man too tired to stand, she did not see shelter. She saw the only thing left standing between her and the snow. She paid the last of her coin, $6, to a fur trader in town who claimed the abandoned lodge and its scrap of frozen land. And everyone who watched her hand over that money called it the last foolish act of a girl with nothing left to lose. They did not know that beneath the frozen earth of that forgotten lodge lay something sealed away for 20 years. Something that would not only save her life, but would one day bring an entire dying town back from the edge of ruin. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten tonight, a place the world seems to have written off, we want you to tell us in the comments, because this story was made for you. And if stories like hers are ones you want to keep finding your way to, consider following or subscribing to this channel so you never miss the next one. Clara had not always known cold like this. She had grown up in a modest timber house on the eastern edge of Hollow Pine, the only child of Thomas Whitfield, a quiet, careful man who had once worked as a surveyor for the railroad before his lungs gave out and he turned to smaller work, mending fences, keeping ledgers for the mercantile, doing whatever honest labor a tired body could still manage. Her mother, Ruth, had died of fever when Clara was 11, and it was her father who raised her after that, alone, in a house that smelled of pine smoke and old paper. Thomas Whitfield was not a wealthy man, but he was a meticulous one, and it was from him that Clara learned the 2 things that would matter most in the years to come: how to read a ledger the way other people read a face, watching for the places where the numbers did not quite agree with the story being told, and how to listen, truly listen, to the old-timers of the territory, the trappers and prospectors and railroad men who drifted through Hollow Pine with stories nobody else had the patience to hear. Her father used to tell her that every abandoned thing had a history nobody had bothered to ask about, and that history was worth more than gold to the person willing to go looking for it. He said it about old ledgers, about half-finished maps, about the crumbling cabins scattered through the mountains, remnants of a fur trade that had boomed and gone quiet a generation before. Clara used to sit at his knee in the evenings while he taught her to read columns of figures by lamplight, and though she did not know it then, he was preparing her, in his quiet, unhurried way, for a life that would ask more of her than either of them could have guessed. He also taught her patience with her hands, sewing, mending, keeping things whole long after most people would have thrown them away, a habit that made her, by 16, the girl in Hollow Pine that women brought their torn coats and broken quilts to. Not because she was the cheapest, but because she was the one who could see what a thing had been before it broke, and bring it back to that. It was a small trade, a woman's trade, but it kept food on their table after her father's health began to fail in earnest, and it taught her the deeper lesson underneath all of it, that value did not disappear just because something looked ruined. It only went into hiding, waiting for someone patient enough to find it again. Her father died when she was 19, quietly, in his sleep, after a winter of coughing that no doctor in the territory could cure. And it was in the weeks after his burial that Clara first understood how precarious her place in the world had always been. The house had never truly been theirs outright. There had been a debt against it from years before, a debt her father had been quietly paying down, and when he died, the paper on that debt passed, through a tangle of frontier law and family obligation, to her father's older brother, Silas, a hard, calculating man who had spent most of his life resenting the fact that Thomas, not he, had inherited their own father's good name in town. Silas moved into the house within a month, telling Clara it was only proper, that a young unmarried woman could not be expected to manage a debt like that on her own, that he would take care of everything. For a while she believed him, or wanted to. She kept house for him, cooked his meals, mended his clothes, told herself this was simply what family did for family. It took her the better part of a year to understand that Silas had never intended to let her stay. The fall came on a gray afternoon in late autumn, though Clara would later think of it as arriving all at once, the way a held breath finally breaks. Silas called her into the front room where her father used to keep his ledgers, and told her, without much ceremony, that he had decided to sell the house to a cattleman from the valley, that the debt her father left behind was larger than she had ever been told, and that she was, in his words, a grown woman fully capable of making her own way. He offered her $7, the last of what he called her share. Though Clara had done the arithmetic enough times in her head to know it was nowhere near a fair portion of anything her father had built. She did not argue. Arguing with Silas Whitfield had never once changed his mind, and she had learned, in the year since her father's death, that dignity sometimes meant leaving a room before it could be taken from you by force. She packed what little was truly hers, her mother's sewing needles, a wool coat, a Bible with her father's handwriting in the margins, and walked out of Hollow Pine on a morning when the sky already smelled of snow. She told herself she would find work in one of the mining camps to the north, that a woman who could sew and keep books could make herself useful anywhere, and for 2 days that plan held together well enough. But on the third day, the weather turned in the way mountain weather does, swiftly and without mercy. And what began as a light snow became, within hours, a blinding, howling wall of white that erased the trail beneath her feet and turned the world into nothing but cold and noise. She walked because stopping meant dying, though by the end she could no longer feel her hands well enough to know if they were still her own. It was in the last hour of light, when her legs had begun to fail her, and the trees around her had become indistinguishable shapes in the storm, that she saw it, a low, dark shape against the white, half buried in drift, one corner of a roofline still holding its shape against the wind. She did not know then that it was an old trapper's lodge, abandoned for the better part of 2 decades. She only knew it was the only shelter the world had offered her, and she went toward it with the last of whatever strength the cold had not yet taken. The lodge, when she reached the door and forced it open against a season of ice, was smaller than it had looked from outside, a single low room with a stone hearth gone cold, and a roof that had somehow held despite years of neglect, though snow had drifted in through a broken shutter and lay in a pale wedge across the floor. It smelled of dust and old smoke, and something else beneath that, cedar perhaps, or tallow, the scent of a place that had once been lived in with care. Clara built what fire she could from broken furniture and the dry husks of old traps hanging along one wall, and she survived that first night the way people survive such nights, by refusing, minute by minute, to stop. In the days that followed, once the storm broke and the world went silent and white and impossibly still. She made her way back toward Hollow Pine to find out who owned the abandoned place, thinking she might beg forgiveness for trespassing or offer to pay something toward its upkeep. What she found instead was a fur trader named Ezra Combs, an old man with a face like weathered leather, who told her the lodge had belonged to a trapper called Elias Boone, dead now some 20 years, with no family anyone had ever traced, and that the land had sat unclaimed and untaxed ever since, a nuisance no one in town wanted to be bothered with. When Clara asked what it would cost to claim it properly for herself, Ezra Combs laughed, not unkindly, and said $6 would settle whatever paper needed settling, and that she was welcome to the old fool's shack if she was fool enough to want it. She paid him every remaining coin she had in the world without hesitation, because the alternative was walking back out into a winter that had already tried once to kill her, and because some quiet, stubborn part of her, the part her father had built with all those evenings of ledgers and patience, told her that a place with a history like that, a trapper who had vanished into legend, a cabin no one else wanted, might hold more than anyone in Hollow Pine had bothered to look for. It was in her second week at the lodge, while she was clearing the small stone hearth of years of ash and searching for dry wood to keep herself through the coldest nights, that Clara first noticed the floor was wrong. It was a small thing, the kind of detail only someone trained to notice inconsistencies, someone raised by a man who read ledgers for a living, might catch. One section of the packed earth floor near the back wall sat very slightly higher than the rest, and the boards laid across it, unlike the weathered gray planks everywhere else in the lodge, had been cut and fitted with a care that did not match the rest of the cabin's rough construction. She spent an evening simply looking at it before she worked up the will to pry at the edge with the handle of an old trapping iron, and when the boards finally gave way, what she found beneath them was not gold, not yet, but a small tin box, rusted at the seams, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth that had somehow kept the worst of the damp away. Inside the box was a folded letter, the ink faded but legible, written in a careful, deliberate hand, and beneath the letter, a leather-bound ledger no larger than a hymnal, its pages filled with columns of names, dates, and figures that meant nothing to her at first glance, but which she recognized, immediately, and with a jolt of something like recognition, as the same kind of careful record-keeping her own father had taught her to read. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, only headed to whoever finds this, if I do not return. It was signed Elias Boone. The days that followed became, for Clara, less about survival, and more about a slow, careful unraveling of a mystery that had been sealed in the earth for 2 decades. Elias Boone's letter, written in the winter of 1866, explained that he had spent nearly 15 years trapping and trading through the mountains above Hollow Pine, and that in his later years, as the fur trade thinned and the town below him struggled through a series of hard winters and a mining collapse that had emptied half its homes, he had quietly taken it upon himself to do something the town's own leaders had failed to do. He had kept an honest account of every debt owed and owing among the trappers, prospectors, and small families scattered through those hills, a shadow ledger of the true value moving through that country, separate from the corrupted books kept by the one man in Hollow Pine who controlled most of its formal credit, a man named Josiah Pruitt, founder of the town's only bank. Boone's ledger recorded, in his same careful hand, years of loans Pruitt had extended to desperate families at ruinous rates, loans Pruitt had then seized upon to claim land, mining rights, and timber tracts across the valley whenever a debtor fell even slightly behind. Land Pruitt then quietly resold at enormous profit under other names, so that no one in town ever fully understood how much of Hollow Pine's surrounding country had passed into his hands. Boone, it seemed, had intended to bring this ledger to a territorial magistrate the following spring, along with a strong box of gold dust and coin he had spent years setting aside. Dust and coin, he explained in his letter, had come not from his own trapping alone, but from small, careful contributions of trappers and settlers who trusted him to hold their savings safely away from Pruitt's bank. A kind of informal, honest vault built on nothing but a mountain man's reputation for keeping his word. But Elias Boone never made it to that spring. Town records, which Clara later found buried in the county courthouse in Hollow Pine, showed only that a trapper by that name was presumed lost in an avalanche in the winter of 1867. His cabin abandoned, his affairs never settled. His name slowly forgotten by a town too busy with its own hardships to wonder what he might have left behind. Clara sat with that ledger for 3 full days, reading it by firelight until her eyes ached, understanding slowly that she was holding, in her cold, calloused hands, the buried truth of an entire town's suffering, and, tucked into the false floor beneath it, in a second smaller compartment she found only after emptying the first, a strong box heavy enough to require both arms to lift, filled with gold dust, coin, and a scattering of silver that Boone had spent a decade quietly gathering on behalf of people who had trusted him and never known what became of their trust. She did not tell anyone in Hollow Pine what she had found, not at first, because she understood, with the same clear-eyed instinct her father had given her, that a woman alone with a fortune and no protection was in more danger than a woman alone with nothing at all. Instead, she spent the following weeks doing what she knew how to do. She cross-referenced Boone's ledger against every public record she could find in the town courthouse, matching names, dates, and land transfers, quietly confirming what the old trapper had died trying to prove, that Josiah Pruitt's bank had, for the better part of 2 decades, been built on a foundation of manipulated debts and stolen land. She discovered, among the names in Boone's careful columns, families she had known her whole life. The Hendersons who had lost their timber claimed the same winter their eldest son died of fever. The Alvarez family, who had once run the town's only working mill before Pruitt foreclosed on equipment they had never truly been behind on paying for. And, with a chill that went beyond the cold of the mountain air, her own father's name, a small loan he had taken years before Clara was born, a debt Pruitt's ledger claimed had never been paid off. Though Boone's shadow ledger showed clearly, in her father's own signature witnessed beside it, that it had. It did not take long for word to travel that the Whitfield girl was living up at old Boone's abandoned lodge, and it took even less time for that word to reach Josiah Pruitt himself. A heavy-set, soft-spoken man, whose gentle manner in the bank's front office concealed, as Clara now understood better than anyone alive. A will as hard as the mountain granite around them. Pruitt came to the lodge himself one gray afternoon in early spring, driving a fine 2-horse sleigh up a trail that had only recently become passable, and offered, with every appearance of Christian kindness, to buy the worthless old claim from her for $15. More, he said, than such a ruin of a property could possibly be worth to anyone, and certainly more than a young woman alone should be expected to manage through another winter. Clara understood, watching his eyes move briefly and too carefully toward the disturbed earth near the back wall, that he already suspected there was more to the lodge than snow and old furs, though she did not yet know how. She declined his offer, politely, and told him she intended to stay through the summer at least. Pruitt's kindness thinned visibly at that answer, and within the month, Clara began to feel the particular pressure a small frontier town can bring to bear on someone it wants gone. The mercantile in Hollow Pine suddenly found itself unable to extend her credit for supplies. A rumor began circulating that the old lodge sat on land legally still contested, and Ezra Combs, The fur trader who had sold her the claim in good faith was visited by the bank's lawyer and quietly warned that the sale might not have been entirely proper. Clara understood, watching this slow tightening of the noose, that Pruitt intended to force her out the same way her uncle had, through paper and pressure rather than open confrontation, and that if she did nothing, she would lose everything a second time. This time with the truth of an entire town's suffering locked away in a strongbox no one would ever find again. So Clara did the one thing her father had spent her whole childhood quietly preparing her to do. She went, not to Pruitt, and not to the magistrate alone where her word as an unmarried woman with no standing might easily be dismissed, but to the families themselves, the Hendersons and the Alvarezes, and a dozen others whose names filled Boone's careful ledger, and she showed them, patiently, the way her father had once shown her, exactly where the numbers did not agree with the story they had been told for 20 years. She brought Boone's ledger alongside the county's own recorded deeds, laid them side by side on the Hendersons' kitchen table by lamplight, and let people see for themselves, in a dead trapper's careful hand, that their losses had not been misfortune or their own failure, but the deliberate design of a man they had trusted with their savings. It took weeks to gather the families willing to stand together and bring their case before the territorial court in the county seat. Weeks in which Pruitt's pressure on Clara grew sharper. An attempted eviction notice on the lodge that a sympathetic county clerk quietly delayed. A rumor spread that she had stolen the ledger rather than found it even. On one frightening evening, 2 of Pruitt's hired men appearing at the lodge's door at dusk, offering to buy the ledger outright for a sum meant to frighten more than tempt. Clara did not open the door that night, and she did not sleep, but she also did not break. Because she understood, with a clarity that had grown in her through every hardship since her father's death, that the ledger and the gold were never truly hers to keep quiet about. They belonged, in the truest sense, to everyone whose name filled those careful columns, and to the memory of an old trapper who had died trying to make things right. The hearing, when it finally came, in the spring of what would later simply be called the year the bank fell, was not the dramatic courtroom reckoning of dime novels, but something quieter and, in its way, far more devastating for a man like Josiah Pruitt. A territorial judge, presented with Boone's meticulous ledger, matching land records, and the sworn testimony of nearly a dozen Hollow Pine families whose stories all traced the same pattern of manipulated debt, found sufficient cause to order a full accounting of the bank's records, an accounting that, once begun, could not be stopped or bought off, and which revealed within months a pattern of fraud so extensive that Pruitt's bank was placed under territorial receivership, his personal assets seized to begin repaying the very families he had ruined. Pruitt himself, rather than facing the harsher justice some in town might have wished on him, simply vanished from Hollow Pine before the receivership was complete, leaving behind a half-packed house and a reputation that would follow him, in whispers, wherever he went next. It was, in the end, not vengeance Clara had wanted, only the truth restored to daylight, and the strong box of gold Elias Boone had spent a decade quietly gathering became, under her guidance and with the blessing of the families who recognized their own names in his ledger, the seed of something new, a modest community fund, administered honestly, that helped the Hendersons rebuild their mill, helped the Alvarez family reclaim their timber rights, and helped a dozen other households through the hard seasons that followed, exactly as Elias Boone had intended it to. 20 years too late for him to see it happen, but not too late for the town he had quietly tried to protect. Clara Whitfield did not become a wealthy woman from any of it, not in the way the world usually measures wealth. She kept the lodge, repaired now with a proper roof and a second room added on, and she became, in the years that followed, the closest thing Hollow Pine had to an honest keeper of accounts. The woman families brought their contracts to before they signed them. The one who taught, patiently and without judgment, the daughters and sons of the very families Pruitt had once ruined, how to read a ledger the way her own father had taught her. Watching always for the places where the numbers did not quite agree with the story being told. She thought often, in the quiet hours by her hearth, of the 20-year-old girl who had stumbled half-frozen through a snowstorm believing she had nothing left in the world, and of how close she had come to walking past that low dark shape against the white without stopping. And of Elias Boone, a man she never met, who had died trying to protect people he had no obligation to protect, and whose patience, sealed away in a false floor for 2 decades, had waited for someone willing to look a little closer at a thing everyone else had already written off. It was not luck, she came to understand, that had led her to that lodge. Or not luck alone. It was the same lesson her father had spent her whole childhood teaching her, without either of them quite knowing why it mattered, that value does not disappear when something looks ruined. It only goes into hiding, waiting for someone patient enough and honest enough to find it again. We began this story by telling you that a 20-year-old woman named Clara Whitfield was cast out into a snowstorm with almost nothing, and that she paid the last of her coin for an abandoned trapper's lodge that everyone in Hollow Pine considered worthless. We told you something was buried beneath it that would change her life and restore an entire community. And now you know what that was. Not simply gold, though there was gold, but the truth an honest man had died trying to preserve. And the patient, careful eye of a young woman who had been taught, long before she ever needed the lesson, that nothing overlooked is ever truly without worth. Clara never forgot the cold of that night in the storm, and she never forgot, either, that it was that same cold that led her, half by accident and half by the quiet instincts her father had given her, to the one place in the world that would give everything back to her, and to a town that badly needed giving back to as well. Thank you for spending this time with Clara's story, and with us. If it moved you, we would be glad if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it tonight, and if you have not already, please follow or subscribe to this channel, so that the next story like this one finds its way to you. Before you go, we would love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? A person, a place, an old forgotten thing? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one. Until next time, stay close.